Welcome, ladies and gents. Chris Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter. Or of course, you can subscribe to the channel. And as you can see, I've got my good friend Jamie Bourne from Punch Perfect Boxing joining us today. I'm delighted to have you, Jamie.
Thank you very much for having me, mate. And yeah, having you on mine very soon. So I'm sure we'll be talking a lot in the next couple of weeks.
Which is great. I'm not complaining, Jamie, even though I
No,
feel
me
I feel
neither.
very let down by Jamie of late. Not long ago, it was his girl's birthday, and he refused to have a little meeting on the channel. He prioritized his girlfriend. We can't be having this. Someone's got to, you know what? Someone has to leave a comment down below for a forfeit for Jamie to do on one of his episodes. It might be, I don't know, a tablespoon of red chili powder or something like that. I want to hear ideas for forfeits for Jamie Bourne because his behavior was unacceptable.
I'll do it on a Thursday night live stream. I'll get it done. I'll do some
Wicked.
kind of
So on
forfeit.
Thursday night, right? So everybody, you got to leave your comments down below, and we will come up with an idea, maybe one that gets the most likes. The idea that gets the most likes, Jamie will have to do the forfeit, but be realistic, people. He's not going to
Yeah,
run
come
across naked. You know, something like eating raw garlic cloves, red hot chili peppers, something like that.
on. Yeah,
Let's get
100%.
started with the episode. Jamie, I want to talk to you about the heavyweight division. Obviously, we saw some clarity this weekend in terms of Alexander Usyk putting on a masterclass performance, I felt, against Anthony Joshua. I want to talk to you about the future, though, in terms of where the fighters go from here. There's been a lot of talk about Usyk saying that he only wants to fight Tyson Fury and nobody else. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that fight was not to happen. And, you know, the signs are looking good. But let's say it wasn't to happen. Fury was to stay retired. Where would Usyk go from here?
I think it's very difficult to think of another scenario, to be honest, for Usyk, because he's jumped up and obviously he kind of got his feet wet by taking Witherspoon and then Chisora. But to then jump up and take on, obviously, Anthony Joshua as the unified champion and top three in the division, however you want to rank him in that three, you know, you've kind of jumped right in there and set the bar high nice and early. So anything else really sort of feels like a step downwards, unless it's going to be the other of the three in Fury or Wilder. And obviously Wilder's dropped a little bit because of his defeats to Fury. So it's very tough to kind of see where he goes. I think Usyk's someone that always wants to challenge himself. So if he did take another fight in the interim, I'm sure it would be someone that he deems a challenge. And looking around, I think when you see the ones that are sort of knocking on the door in terms of Joseph Parker and Joe Joyce are obviously getting it on as well. I know we're going to be talking about it a bit later, but it looks like kind of going to see Michael Hunter and Hughie Fury. And there feels like there's a lot of these fights that are happening at the minute to kind of get people in a position. Andy Ruiz, Luis Ortiz, Wilder, Helenius. There'll be someone if he wants to, but I'll be honest, man, my heart is on Undisputed, and it seems difficult to think of anything else for Usyk at this point.
The thing is, though, is it the question of Undisputed or is it the question of Usyk Fury? So, for instance, let's say, for argument's sake, Fury was to stay retired. Let's say, I don't know, Wilder beats Helenius and the WBC do what the WBC do and make that as a final eliminator, say, and we end up seeing Usyk Wilder as a fight for the Undisputed. Does that still get the juices flowing in the same way? Or because his stock fell, as you say, because he lost to Fury, you know, does that affect it in any way for you?
No, so I think Usyk just wants that belt. I just think he wants Undisputed, you know, because he done it at cruiserweight. We've kind of seen that run from him before, and he's always been someone that's talked about his goal and his missions, and he's always highlighted Undisputed. So whilst Fury is the sort of top of the tree, that kind of goal to aim for, I think Undisputed is the most important thing to him.
I agree. In terms of Alexander Usyk, you're talking about a guy who was a world amateur gold medalist, an Olympic gold medalist, undefeated, undisputed cruiserweight champion, now unified heavyweight champion, going for undisputed, never tasted defeat, achieved all these things on the road. If he was to beat Tyson Fury and just have the perfect career, and these are stacked divisions, the cruiserweight division when he dominated it was stacked. The heavyweight division today is stacked. If he was to do that, do you think it puts him in a conversation for being the best of all time? I'm not saying it would solidify that. There are always conversations when it comes to these things, but do you think it would catapult him into that group of elite fighters that are in the conversation?
I think so. It's like you say, when you say the best ever, it's almost not like a placement, like a bracket almost, if you're kind of good enough to fit into that conversation. And I've always felt that his cruiserweight run, obviously alongside Holyfield, is the greatest run in cruiserweight history. To then move up and to beat the top two guys in the division for all of the belts, it's special stuff. And like you say, you do have to include the amateur stuff as well. He won everything, European, World, Olympics. Was really good in WSBs as well. So I do feel like he would be a worthy person to include in that conversation. I was talking about it with someone the other day that kind of the best ever conversation. I think when you kind of think of when people like to go right back and include people in that have had over 200, 300 fights, it can sometimes become a bit saturated and difficult to compare someone like Usyk that achieves so much in 20 odd fights versus someone that achieves so much in 300 odd fights. But I think if you narrow it down to the last 50 years, where he starts being in a more realistic conversation where you can kind of quantify things a little bit more, I think Usyk would be right up there as one of the greats.
Indeed, and somebody actually left a comment on my channel to say, how can you say that about somebody who would have only have had 21 fights if he was to beat Fury? But the thing is, in a way, it's even more impressive that you can do all of that within 21 fights. You know, had he fought, say, 15 learning fights, so to speak, against domestic level guys, and instead of, you know, being at, I don't know, 21-0, he ended up finishing a career at, say, 30. But a lot of those guys were just, you know, nobodies. Is that going to make him a greater fighter than what he is now? Do you see what I'm saying? So,
exactly.
You know, I think we have to be in awe, really, of what we're watching here. I think he really is terrific. And of course, Tyson Fury is also somebody who's trying to chase greatness himself. If he was to go and beat Alexander Usyk, I still think he would need to fight Anthony Joshua personally, because Usyk's dominated one category, weight division, cleared it out. Then he's done, you know, something else special at heavyweight. Whereas Fury is an out-and-out heavyweight. So to me, he would have to clean up the heavyweight division. I don't know if I'm making sense with that, but there's a little bit more for Fury to do, I think.
Yeah, there is this assumption that even though Usyk's been great in his last two fights and beating Anthony Joshua, there still is this assumption that he'd be too small for Fury, and there's like this, Fury just goes and beats him anyway. I get what you mean. If you want to be the best of the generation, there can be no doubt about it. And I think the only way you get rid of that doubt is to beat everyone.
Agreed. Now, in terms of Anthony Joshua, he's obviously now at a crossroads in his career. Many people feel as though he's staring into an abyss, really. He's in a position now where he's moving over to DAZN with a loss. A lot of people are wondering what the future holds for Anthony Joshua. He had that post-fight meltdown. I know that you didn't see it initially. You jumped straight on to do your post-fight reaction, so you heard about it. You've seen it since then. What do you make of Anthony Joshua in terms of where he's at mentally, emotionally, and also where does he go from here?
Yeah, I think the first part of the question, like you say, I kind of jumped straight on live to do a reaction to the fight, and everyone was getting in the. I started the live stream talking about how impressed I was with Anthony Joshua, and all the messages were like, "Oh my God, he's in a meltdown. What is he going on about?" So someone sent me it, and I watched it on the live stream. The way I was kind of thinking about it is sometimes you can really prepare yourself for something and still come up short, and it can be a really bitter pill to swallow, and sometimes you don't react well to it. It seemed a little bit out of character for Joshua, which is the reason it seemed so strange. I mean, if Fury done that after a defeat, I don't think too many people would actually be that surprised by that sort of behaviour, but the way Joshua's carried himself in the past. So it was strange, and I do think I've played in football teams in the past where you're coming up against someone so much better, and you can prepare, you can mentally get yourself in the place, you can even do really well in the game, but then you just fall short, and you can argue with people on your team, and you can get frustrated, and you can just act kind of out of character. The difference is, in those situations, you'll have someone that puts their arm around you, calms you down, and you kind of get over it quite quickly. I think someone probably, as Fraser Clark said, should have put their hand on Joshua and just let him kind of come away from the situation.
With regards to that, before we move on to you telling us about what the future holds for AJ, I don't know if you've seen the footage that was released afterwards where it's sort of like almost a higher vantage point. It looked as though, I mean, when he was sort of going and spudding everyone and saying respect, he was a little bit aggressive with that initially, AJ. But then at one point, it looked like when he walked past the trainer of Alexander Usyk, they both sort of didn't move their shoulders, and it created a little bit of a connection as they were walking past each other. That seemed to really rile up Anthony Joshua, but he was the one who was walking towards them. He shouldn't really have been in that area. So I've actually revised my position a little bit on this. Don't get me wrong, my initial assessment that, it's done, you move on. He hasn't hit anybody or anything like that, but he did react a little bit worse than I initially thought.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is it something that is, like you're saying, it's been bubbling and it could just be frustration? Like you're saying, you gave the analogy there of when you've played football. But is it possible that it's something a little bit deeper with AJ? Because is it Highfield Boxing who put up the clip?
Yeah.
He was basically, he made the point that it seemed as though he was moving away from his corner towards Eddie Hearn and Frank Smith and almost avoided his corner. Did you see anything in that? Do you think that maybe he really doesn't feel close to them? He does, for some reason, feel let down by them? And if so, does he feel like he's lacking guidance right now?
Potentially, you know, they said in the training camp, Robert Garcia was there to change his mentality. And Robert said in a lot of interviews that there were times where AJ would say something and we had to kind of shut him down and get him thinking a different way. And maybe AJ, like you say, sort of feels that he took himself to a place where he's uncomfortable. Perhaps there were things in camp that he didn't enjoy or didn't feel were the right things, but he put up with it because he felt like that's what he needed to do to win the fight. And then when it doesn't go your way, perhaps then he was just sort of seeking out people to blame and he didn't want to hear how well he'd done after the fight, because there was the clip with Lomachenko as well where Lomachenko said, "You're a great boxer," and he was like, "No, great boxers win," and he got angry, a little bit of swearing as well in there. And like you say, the sort of spud into everyone was more like a sort of lazy jab that he was throwing out there. It was like a bit more aggressive than that. So yeah, again, it's so hard to know in those situations because it's such high pressure, and I feel like it had been brewing for AJ. And we'd seen in the fight camp between the last fight him go on Twitter and rant at people and the stuff at Loughborough Uni and calling out Joe Joyce and talking about Amir Khan's misses. Like, he's had little moments. And someone commented on my live stream actually when he did that IFL interview with Coogan where he went back to the ends and started talking, and he was saying some stuff in that interview that came across a bit strange and a bit weird. And kind of with hindsight, that interview, there seemed to be almost like a link between the two, and maybe we could have seen something like that coming potentially. But it's been interesting.
In terms of where he moves on from here, then, how do you go about taking into account the mental aspect that he's in, the position that he's in, the loss that he's just had? How do you go about rebuilding his career if you're DAZN? Do you consider the money-making fights? Do you consider them to be developmental fights instead that he can learn from? Do you just consider them to be gimmies whereby he's going to build his confidence and his reputation? You know, if he goes and sparks out 4 people who might not be great shakes, but he's looking great, is that going to win people over? What do you think is the way that they should approach the future of AJ, and what way do you think they will approach the future of AJ?
Yeah, I know we agree on this in parts because you joined my live the other night where we sort of went back and forth on it. And I feel like he just needs that pressure of not having to win for what comes next. It's about sort of fight by fight what it does for AJ, because he's been in a position where he links up with Angel Fernandez, he links up with Robert Garcia, and there's so much pressure on him to win. There's really no sort of learning phase with it at all, because if he doesn't get things right in the past, he's been good enough to still win. But in the type of fights against Usyk, etc., if you're not good enough, you're going to lose. So it'd be good to him to have those sort of fights where he can put some things into practice. And it's very difficult when you get to a certain commercial point and the deal he signed with DAZN to just face knockover jobs. But I think you have to kind of be clever, and Eddie Hearn's quite good at picking out opponents that us boxing fans know aren't great, but there's a way to sell it. And I've been sort of looking through the rankings and stuff, and there's a lot of fights where fighters are busy, as we mentioned earlier. A lot of the top guys have got fights between now and the end of the year. I know a lot of people thought Dillian White would be the obvious one, but even he looks like he's going to be fighting Daniel Dubois. So it's very difficult. And when you look through those rankings where people aren't busy, there's some tough fights in there, and ones that maybe aren't the right one. If AJ still isn't mentally there, you just look at some of the bogeymen in the division, like a Bacoli or a Frank Sanchez or someone like that. So sort of names I was sort of more looking towards was someone like a Chris Arreola or someone like that. Someone that doesn't pose too much danger, will give AJ a couple of rounds, but ultimately probably should be getting him out of there. And plenty of room to be able to test some things in there as well. I feel like he just needs those sorts of fights. When the fight with Usyk was coming around, some people said to me that they thought AJ was going to win inside 6 rounds. And I said, do you know the last time he won inside 6 rounds was Eric Molina in 2016? He hasn't been destroying people. Like, he knocked out Povetkin, he knocked out Pulev, but they were fights where at the end of it, I think he had a bit of a sigh of relief because he had to work for those victories. I think it's about time that AJ got back in his bag a little bit and just had some fun, had some learning, and got rid of a couple of people.
Yeah, I mean, something that Hatman has said in the past, and Steve Kim as well, that in a way, because he won the title so early and he was such a commercial star, they almost rushed him and limited the amount of times he was also fighting per year, 1 or 2 times a year, which can actually affect development. So now that he's in a position where you're thinking maybe he needs some knockover jobs for the confidence, you're then starting to think, if he goes down that route where it's just for the confidence, is he missing out on some valuable time for development? Whereas if he goes for tough fights that require development, well, then you're taking away from the other side, whereby you're potentially risking a bad showing or a defeat, or even draining him mentally again and emotionally. So it's a difficult balance to actually find. I like the idea of Chris Arreola, particularly if they do it in the United States. That could open up a market for him there as well. I've always liked the idea of Jarrell Miller again. I like that for Fury too, when they were talking about him as a comeback fight, because he's not looking like he used to look, but he's a loudmouth, trash-talking American. The build-up would be fantastic. They've got some previous there, these two, and he's durable. So, you know, if he's not going to be able to bring that incessant pressure that he used to bring when he was on the juice, it might just give Anthony Joshua an opportunity to work while still being able to build his sort of name up. I think that's what they've got to try and find that sort of balance. And it's quite hard, really. Otto Varlin's another one that people have been talking about if you want him to prepare him for southpaws. But the other thing I'm wondering, it's unlikely that AJ is going to get to fight Alexander Usyk ever again. So should he be focused on just building confidence and developing? Or do you think they should, because of this dilemma we're talking about finding the perfect balance, should they be looking at the likes of Fury and Deontay Wilder and thinking which fighters are best preparation for them? For instance, Zhili Zhang in China would be a massive fight commercially. It carries a big risk because he's a banger and he's got good timing. He doesn't have great stamina. And he's old, so you would assume that Anthony Joshua would get through that, but it carries the risk of throwing him in with a puncher after he's coming off of back-to-back defeats. But is that better preparation for a guy like Deontay Wilder? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it's a sort of mix of both. Start off kind of doing what I said, which is just about getting a bit of confidence back, getting a bit of time with Robert Garcia, or he may not even be with Robert Garcia, who knows, because obviously Robert is based in the US. He's got a lot of world level fighters in the US that have got some big fights coming up over the next 12 months. And he's mentioned that he wants to be there more than he does anywhere else. So AJ will probably have to compromise a bit with that as well. So I think to start with, it's just about getting a bit of confidence back, feeling good again, getting some wins and some destructive wins back on the resume. But then, like you say, I think it's great when a promoter or a manager prepares their fighter for what's at the top of the division, not necessarily what the next fight is. I think of Virgil Ortiz fighting McKinson. That's not an ideal style to necessarily go in with, but it's better prep for Terence Crawford than it is to fight Avanesyan, for example, who you're going to be involved in a bit of a tear-up with. I like it when a fighter gets guided properly, and I think it's a great point that you make, that perhaps getting him ready for what could come down the line when he's back in a high-pressured situation could be the way of thinking moving forward.
I want to mention Hrgovic to you, since we did mention Zhili Zhang. I know you did a post-fight review, so people can go and check that out. With me personally, I thought that Hrgovic was always very talented, but the last few fights, I felt as though he's looked a little bit heavy on his feet. And I understand that there's a transition that needs to be made between amateur and professional. A lot of pros want to sit on their shots a lot more, and they want to alter their style. But for me, Hrgovic has moved far too much away from what he used to be. I just, when he first came through, there were comparisons to Vitaly Klitschko. He would be very smart at coming off of at an angle and using a sort of languid lead hand and making you fall onto shots, luring you onto shots. He's become a little bit different. And when he was being hit as well at the weekend, there were moments where he was looking away. He looked disinterested. He looked confused almost. There were people that were comparing it to an Andrew Galotta type of meltdown. I know you're very much into amateur boxing. You're very aware of Hrgovic even prior to his pro career. Where do you see Hrgovic? And from here, we're going to sort of segue onto the other sharks that are on the periphery. But where do you see Hrgovic in terms of his future moving on from here? Do you see decline there? Was it just a bad night?
Yeah, I agree with you on the weight. He used to be in the sort of low 220s, and then he jumped up against Molina to 230, and then since then it's been in the 240s. And like you say, he's just looked a little bit more sluggish. I've never been overly high on him. I do think there's always been a couple of flaws with him there. But I'm kind of going to give him a little bit of a pass for the Zhang fight, because I think people overlook Zhang as much as they sort of, people were sort of more critical of Hrgovic. But Zhang is very wily. He can bang, like you say. He has his limitations physically. He's a bit old and he can't really manage the pace very well, but he knows how to find that left hand. And when he does it definitely hurts. He's a big guy as well. But I kind of went back and had a little look at sort of Hrgovic's camp going into this. not the greatest. Obviously, lost his father earlier this year, who he was incredibly close with. I think if you watch a lot of Hrgovic's fights, he'd always seek out his father afterwards and he'd celebrate in the ring, even if it was a one-round demolition of a gatekeeper or something. You know, him and his father were really close. And the other thing is, first camp with Ronnie Shields, he obviously split with his trainer, Pedro Diaz, who he'd been with for a while, moving over to fight with Ronnie, train with Ronnie Shields. That's something that takes a little bit of getting used to. And maybe when he was reacting weirdly to being hurt, perhaps it was just not having the usual voices kind of reassuring him and whatever. So I think there were some things that probably didn't help him going into it in terms of the camp. I think Zhang was being underrated as well. But I can't say that I've ever felt his ceiling was necessarily Fury, Usyk, Wilder, AJ. I've always felt it would be slightly below that, and kind of competing, but not necessarily winning at the top level.
And it's interesting because you make a great point there about his father. We sit here and we talk about Anthony Joshua and the pressure he's under, and you know the outburst, the emotional outburst. Having a defeat and having a lot of pressure and expectation, yes, it's a big thing. We haven't lived in his shoes. It must be terrible to not even be able to go out to the supermarket without being mobbed. There must be a lot of pressure there. But to lose a loved one, that is going to be a lot more traumatic emotionally than what Anthony Joshua's gone through, a defeat. So, you know, you can imagine it's easy, I guess, for us to say, well, he looked disinterested. Maybe he was disinterested because, you know, the one person, like you're saying, the voice that he valued so much just was absent. So that's a great point you've made there. And maybe he can, therefore, find some emotional stability and come back. In terms of other guys, you said that you felt that his ceiling would always be a little bit lower than the elite sort of guys. There are a lot of sort of sharks, as I call them, that swimming on the peripheries, waiting to take a chunk out of the champions. You know, you've got certain fights that have already been spoken about being made. I know you've been speaking, for instance, about Dillian Whyte and Daniel Dubois being agreed. You've got Hughie Fury potentially fighting Michael Hunter. You've then got guys that have yet to really make the big step onto the international scene, sort of throw their names into that global public sphere. Guys like Kusubutsky, guys like Jalolov, guys like Arslanbek Makhmudov. I know Makhmudov's Russian, and the way things are at the moment, you wonder whether he's going to get an opportunity. Frank Sanchez is another one who might not be entertaining, but a very skilled fighter. Out of all these sorts of guys, and perhaps someone I've not mentioned, is there anyone you expect to really make the big step over the next 12 months, and someone we're really going to be talking about?
Yeah, I'm interested to see what happens with Makhmudov because he's just signed a deal with Top Rank, and I know he's best friends with Artur Beterbiev, so I think there's been a link there because obviously he's signed with Bob Arum, so he should get some opportunities over there hopefully. So that'll be interesting to see what he can do. But the one for me is Bakadir Jalolov. As you mentioned, he's someone that I followed for a very long time, and what was quite cool about him was when he was coming through the amateurs, he was very good, but there was kind of Joyce, Hrgovic and Yoka ahead of him. And he would still medal at tournaments. He would still compete against those guys. But it was almost like he was not happy to lose, but he was picking things up and kind of riding on their coattails to sort of improve and share the ring with them. And by the time they'd all moved on to the pros, he was so clearly the favourite for the next Olympic cycle, was obviously sort of flicked into the pro game as well at certain points, which a lot of people had some complaints about. But going into the Olympics, there was every weight class, there was favourites to win gold. No one was quite as strong to win gold as Jalolov was. So he's someone I'm really impressed with. And just some of the little things we've seen so far really impressed me, because what he did to Kamil Sokolowski, I think we've become accustomed in this country to seeing a lot of our British prospects really struggling and perhaps getting lucky against him. Jalolov just wiped the floor with him and left him starched on the canvas. So that kind of gives you an idea of what a proper heavyweight prospect should look like. So he really excites me. And I think the other one is Jared Anderson. I know he's had some injuries this year, and last year he was in the running for Prospects of the Year. I'm quite excited to see how quickly they can move him now. He's back this weekend, not been as active this year as we'd have hoped, but he's another one that perhaps the next American heavyweight world champion we could be looking at potentially.
I mean, you could imagine if Dubois was to come through Dillian Whyte, I know that Americans tend not to put their prospects in with other prospects. It seems to be of recent years that they seem to bypass the C and B level fighters and go straight to an A level shot, which personally I don't like, I have to be honest. But the prospect potentially of having one of the best prospects in British boxing in terms of young heavyweights in Daniel Dubois up against an American one in Jared Anderson, that could be built up to be, you know, pretty big. And you could get, I know we never got to see the Gale and Groves fight for a second time, but we should have. And sometimes you can get that crossroads fight early on and then it builds a rivalry for you to get it later on as well. So, you know, I think the heavyweight division seems to be in good nick in terms of its future, in terms of its depth. There's a lot of depth there. Beyond Wilder and, say, Michael Hunter, Jared Anderson, do you think that there's anybody else coming out of the United States in the heavyweight division that might be able to make waves? I know there's another Olympian that, you know, stepped up recently, Torres. Smaller guy. Do you think he is too small for the big guys, or do you think because he is a small guy, he's going to be able to bring something that they've not already seen and might be able to cause a shock here or there?
I think he'll cause a couple of shocks because he never fought like the small man in the amateurs when he come up against the likes of Jalolov, and he got knocked out by Jalolov as well. When you saw him in the Olympic final, you thought he might be a bit tentative. He went after him, and he does like to make a fight of it. He's kind of got this chip on his shoulder. So I think he's going to be really fun. I do think at some point he may be on the receiving end of quite a nasty knockout because of the way he fights, but he's very fun to watch, and he's someone that's kind of comfortable in his own skin and always brings it to his opponent. So he's another one that's quite exciting. Not quite got the talent of Anderson, I would say, perhaps the athleticism either, but he's fun to watch. And if you kind of underestimate him, you could find yourself on your backside quite quickly. Okay,
so final question. How do you see the heavyweight division looking in 18 months from now?
Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk will both be retired in 18 months, I believe.
And who would defend the undisputed? And actually, maybe you should save that for a breakdown. Okay, Fury and Wilder. No, so yeah, forget that. Fury and Usyk will be retired, and then
I think Anthony Joshua will hold a version of a world title again in 18 months. I think Jalolov will be at world level as well, and I think Daniel Dubois will be right up there as well. I feel like you think of how young Dubois is. I think in a couple of years' time, he'll still be in and around it as well. I think Jared Anderson will be right up there. It's going to be fun because a lot of these heavyweights are getting on a bit. A lot of them are fairly old right now. Even Joe Joyce. I mean, a defeat for Joyce could be really kind of detrimental because he's so sort of long in the tooth at this stage. So, yeah, I think Anthony Joshua will have an opportunity to become a 3-time world champion in the next 18 months when one of those belts becomes vacant.
Jamie, thank you so much for coming on. Please let everybody know where they can find you. I'm sure they're all aware of you now. The channel's growing quickly. You're doing a fantastic job over there, but please let everybody know anyway.
Appreciate it, mate. Thank you for having me first and foremost. And if anyone wants to find me, Punch Perfect Boxing on YouTube. A bit like Chris, just talk about the sport that we love. And if you love Chris that much, come over to my channel because you'll see him featuring every so often.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. Appreciate you coming on, my friend. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in as well. Take care. God bless. All right, mate. Take care, yeah?
Cheers, mate. Take care.
Mate, get ready for that forfeit.